So what did I prove via this entire endeavor? It's that testosterone, I shouldn't have even had to prove this, because anyone who knows how androgens work in the first place would know, shove yourself with a bunch of trenbolone, you're going to lose your hair. Why? Because it's androgenic.
Oh my God, dog.
Please do not skip this video, and if you do, just look at the description for timestamps to navigate this video, because it's pretty important. Even with the most effective treatments that we have against androgenetic alopecia, people are still anxious about scalp testosterone and if it causes hair loss or not. In this video, I will be largely responding to Derek from More Plates, More Dates, and his experiment that he did regarding scalp testosterone and dutasteride. Again, use the timestamps in the description to help you navigate this video if you can't actually sit through the entire thing, or just have it in the background while you're doing something a bit more productive. So watch this video as it may answer your questions regarding this topic. On November 30th, 2018, the fitness YouTuber Derek, also known as More Plates, More Dates, made a video demonstrating that he continued to shed hair and lose ground while using 0.5 milligram of dutasteride.
So basically the reference range for a natural, keep in mind, a natural athlete, well, not athlete even, just male, for dihydrotestosterone, this is somebody who has a normal testosterone level and how much DHT they would have without taking anything.
For those of you unfamiliar, in the condition of androgenetic alopecia, or male or even female pattern baldness, testosterone is converted into dihydrotestosterone, also known as DHT. This hormone causes hair on the scalp to miniaturize and eventually lead to baldness in people genetically predisposed to it. DHT is a paracrine hormone, meaning that it is primarily produced in the tissues. In the case of androgenetic alopecia, the focus is on the skin and the scalp tissues. DHT is produced when an enzyme known as 5-alpha reductase comes in contact with circulating testosterone, with a higher concentration of this enzyme in the skin and scalp. Still following along? Let's continue. To combat hair loss, medications like 5-alpha reductase inhibitors are used. To inhibit means essentially to block an enzyme. In this case, that enzyme is 5-alpha reductase. An enzyme is a protein. When this enzyme comes in contact with testosterone, it causes the reaction that turns testosterone into that DHT. Now, post-puberty, DHT plays a minimal role in development, so reducing 5-alpha reductase and DHT is generally safe. Now, I'm not going to go on about post-finasteride syndrome in this video. I'll just tell you that it's bullshit. We can touch on that in another video, but yeah, let's return to the original focus. There are 3 types of 5-alpha reductase enzymes found in different parts of the body. Type 1 is common in the skin, while type 2 is common in the hair follicles. I'm not going to focus on type 3, because that is largely irrelevant to this video. Some research suggests that type 1 concentration in the scalp may vary among individuals. This is the reason why some people may benefit by using dutasteride, because dutasteride blocks all 3 types of the 5-alpha reductase enzyme. It reduces blood levels of DHT by 90 to 95%, and scalp levels by 50 to 80%. These reduction ranges typically occur at 0.5 milligram up to 2.5 milligram, respectively. Finasteride, on the other hand, is a less potent 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. It particularly blocks the 5-alpha reductase type 2 enzyme and reduces serum DHT by 70% and scalp DHT by 30 to 40%. This is often enough to slow down, stop, or even reverse hair loss, depending on the individual's sensitivity to DHT and the timing of intervention. So if you start using this at a Norwood 2, it's likely that you will halt your hair loss or significantly slow it down. But again, the odds for stopping your hair loss or even reversing your hair loss goes up with dutasteride. Derek from More Plates, More Dates mentions that he is using 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride, but stopped using an experimental topical anti-androgen called RU58841.
And on a blatantly super physiological dose of testosterone, and I got my blood done. My dihydrotestosterone was not even readable on the blood work. It was under 5 nanograms per deciliter. And when you put, it's like it can't even be read. Like that's the bottom of where they'll even read it. You know what I mean? So it's less than this. The number won't even show because it's so low. It is less than whatever their bottom that they will detect up to. Castration levels. This is like somebody who would not be able to shed via or have any miniaturization from DHT because there's simply no DHT circulating in their system. So what did I do via taking the Dutasteride to do this? I dropped my DHT to literally nothing. I literally crashed it into nothingness. Well, it increases the amount of free testosterone circulating in your system, but it doesn't really matter. I have a super physiological amount in my system. We already know that. It's been established. Right? DHT is totally out of the equation. There's zero DHT in my system. What did I have? I had a bunch of tests, like probably close to 2,000 nanograms of test. Now, how am I going to assess if I'm shedding or not when I'm still using RU? I dropped the RU. RU has a very short half-life. It's in and out of your system very quickly. It doesn't matter though, because I did this experiment for several weeks to make sure there was no discrepancy in my findings. So
now, RU58841 theoretically blocks androgen receptors in the hair follicles. You see, DHT, once it's formed with the union of a 5-alpha reductase enzyme and testosterone, this DHT needs to bind to a protein, and that protein is called an androgen receptor. Theoretically, blocking these receptors with a molecule that mimics androgens could prevent DHT from signaling to the hair follicle to shed and die. That is, the more of a topical anti-androgen you have that can bind to these androgen receptors, it can outcompete the presence of DHT and essentially serves as a shield against DHT. This is as basic as I can make this, so I hope this explanation was clear and helpful. With that being said, I'm going to allow a segment of Derek from More Plates, More Dates video to play out to see what went wrong with his experiment. I'll be responding to it afterwards, but yeah, I'll let that play and then I'll return.
Got rid of the RU. So now I'm just operating with 200 milligrams of testosterone, TRT, and my Dutasteride, 0.5 milligrams. I have zero DHT. All I have is a supraphysiological amount of testosterone in my system now, and no topical protection. So anything that happens from this point onward is based entirely on whatever can happen at an androgen level or androgen side effects related to the testosterone only. What happened? My shedding started again. About 50 hairs a day, closer to 100 hairs a day after a couple weeks actually. And when everything is aligned for me, I literally lose like 5 to 10 hairs a shower max.
So what's wrong with Derek's experiment? Derek mentioned that he stopped using RU58841 and continued taking Dutasteride at 0.5 milligram a day. Preceding that, he went to go get some blood work done, and the results indicated that he barely had any DHT in his blood. Yet, even in this scenario, he continued to lose hair. So, Derek concludes that it is the remaining testosterone causing his hair loss progression. Why? Well, by taking 0.5 milligram of Dutasteride daily, Derek inhibits circulating 5-alpha reductase and ideally reduces some concentration within the scalp. This will significantly decrease the amount of DHT in both the serum or the blood as well as the scalp. So how could he possibly be mistaken here? Derek is incorrect because he fails to understand that the scalp DHT levels do not always correlate with the serum DHT levels. Remember when I mentioned that DHT is primarily a paracrine hormone? Indeed, most of the DHT in your body will be produced in the site of tissues and not in the blood. That doesn't mean that there isn't any sort of circulating DHT, as Derek points out. Derek and others would benefit greatly by consulting the literature. The Stats Pearl Medical Journal on NCBI by Kevin J. Kinter et al. Is a good starting point. It reveals that tissue DHT can be 5 to 10 times higher than testosterone. Derek also states that his testosterone level is 2,000 nanograms per deciliter.
DHT is totally out of the equation. There's zero DHT in my system. What did I have? I had a bunch of tests, like probably close to 2,000 nanograms of tests.
Which is twice the upper normal high range. To put this into perspective, Derek from More Plates, More Dates is taking exogenous testosterone, which artificially elevates his levels above the normal range for a male in his late 20s, which is around 300 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. In theory, Dutasteride should reduce both type 1 and type 2 5-alpha reductase in the serum and the scalp. Now, when I say serum, that means the bloodstream. However, this isn't 100%, such that there will always be a residual amount of 5-alpha reductase. Typically between 0.5 milligram to 2.5 milligram of dutasteride, scalp DHT levels reduce between 50% to up to 80%, depending on those dose ranges. For the vast majority of men, I mean the most of them, right? This reduction is sufficient to completely halt hair loss and reverse it. However, for someone like Derek, who has boosted his testosterone to twice the high end of the normal range, even a 50% reduction in scalp DHT might not be enough. With 50% reduction of scalp DHT using 0.5 milligram of dutasteride, scalp DHT levels might still increase in the presence of exogenously administered testosterone at levels of 2,000 nanograms per deciliter. Why might this be the case? The physiology of DHT is complex, and while dutasteride significantly reduces type 1 and is also a more potent type 2 inhibitor of 5-alpha reductase than finasteride is, it doesn't completely eliminate these enzymes. Thus, a high level of testosterone can still lead to a substantial conversion of DHT, especially in localized tissues like the scalp. The intricacy of Derek's case further complicates the matter. While he found undetectable serum DHT levels with a daily dose of 0.5 milligram of dutasteride, this doesn't necessarily mean an absolute absence of DHT. Firstly, the undetectable levels might be attributed to the sensitivity of the assay used for the measurement. So in other words, the lab may not have been equipped to precisely analyze his blood work. He does mention how his blood had to be sent to a different country or go through all these sort of loopholes just so he could get the proper numbers on his DHT count.
The results came back. Took about 4 weeks because I guess this is not a very common test. So they had to send it to another country to get tested. The results came back. My dihydrotestosterone was not even readable on the blood work. It was under 5 nanograms per deciliter. And when you put under, like they have like an abnormal under, it's like it can't even be read. Like that's the bottom of where they'll even read it. You know what I mean? So it's less than this.
Additionally, the presence of exogenous testosterone significantly boosting his testosterone levels to supraphysiological, he always says that, supraphysiological levels, means that there's a greater substrate available for the conversion to DHT in the scalp, potentially overpowering the inhibitory effects of dutasteride. In other words, the levels of circulating testosterone might outnumber the amount of dutasteride in the blood, leading to a situation where more testosterone is available to bind to 5-alpha reductase enzymes than there is dutasteride to block them. Dutasteride works by binding to the 5-alpha reductase enzyme, preventing them from converting testosterone into DHT. This is a competitive process that relies on the availability and concentration of dutasteride relative to testosterone. So if the concentration of testosterone significantly exceeds that of dutasteride, it increases the likelihood that testosterone will bind to 5-alpha reductase, leading to the production of DHT. Since enzymes like 5-alpha reductase are not always completely destroyed by the body in the conversion process of testosterone to DHT, they often become reusable, and with that, they may continue to catalyze the conversion of testosterone to DHT as long as both substrates are available. Now, let's be clear. This is likely a unique circumstance that occurs when you're administering yourself with exogenous testosterone to the point where you're at above the normal level. Derek's at 2,000 nanograms per deciliter. The high-end normal range is 1,000 nanograms per deciliter. So unless you're doing something like that, you shouldn't have to worry. This is what makes Derek from More Plates, More Dates experiment largely flawed. It makes any person, especially those who are not taking anabolic steroids or exogenously high amounts of testosterone to reach levels well above what a man would naturally produce, it makes these normal everyday people freak out with their hair shedding, and then they might think that the treatment isn't working, and then they go down this crazy rabbit hole where they say, well, it's testosterone that's causing my hair loss. So, I'm going to do something crazy that will prevent me from producing normal levels of testosterone. Or, in the better case of this, they would probably just stop using dutasteride or finasteride and then just shave their head and, do whatever. When in reality, they probably were going through a shed. Usually, shedding on dutasteride and finasteride is not due to some sort of runaway effect where scalp testosterone is increased, which causes hair loss. I'll be including a well put together video at the end of this video to prove my point, because I already put this in a video, but I feel like I have to do it again in this video. Essentially, that video at the end of this video, or the segment at the end of this video, will show how testosterone, in 3 key points, right? How testosterone is not the culprit for hair loss. It is largely DHT. If someone is still shedding, they need to consider some things, okay? First, you will always shed hair. I've seen people, especially in the consultations that I do, my non-medical consultations, might I add, where they complain about shedding and they tell me that they've lost like 10 to 15 hairs a day, or even some cases 100 hairs a day. This is completely normal. This will happen whether you have androgenetic alopecia or you don't. Your hair will shed on your scalp. It has to shed over time. And the state in which your hair follicles are in, the state of growth, varies across your scalp. Now, when people start using 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like finasteride and dutasteride, it has a significant effect on the anagen growth cycle, such that when you start, a large amount of your sensitive DHT hair follicles will essentially synchronize their growth pattern. So at some point, whether it's 8 months to 2 years down the line, these hairs can potentially shed at the same time, which gives the appearance that the treatment has stopped working, when in reality, this is completely normal. And with further shedding cycles, eventually, these hair follicles will desynchronize in their hair growth patterns and normalize above baseline. I'll leave that video in the description below, so go check it out. Please don't ask any questions about it on this video. Go watch the video that I put in the description. It's called like finasteride takes 3 to 5 years to really work. Something like that. It's going to be in the description, so go check it out. And finally, another case to consider, and this might be a very small, minority of men, but it is another case to consider. Some people just have genes that make their hair follicles so sensitive to DHT that a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor won't be enough. They may need to use a topical anti-androgen like RE58841, clascoterone, spirolactolone, KX826, or purilitamide to combat DHT and the androgen receptor union. Or they might have to boost up to 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride. If these people are usually on finasteride, they sometimes just transition to 0.5 milligram dutasteride. But in any case, these folks who are extremely, extremely sensitive, that even when they catch it in Norwood 1 or Norwood 2 or Norwood 3 at that matter, they'll still lose hair. These people are typically rare. But the general case is that the sooner you catch your hair loss and at the earlier Norwood stages you treat it, the longer you will keep your hair. You can look at the Dutasteride twins as a case study example for this, and also the immense amount of literature that exists on the matter. I've already covered that on my channel, so I'll try to put that in the description below. So that's pretty much my response. Again, the next segment of this video will be another video that I already posted, where I essentially show you how testosterone is not the cause of your hair loss. It's not scalp testosterone. It still comes back to DHT. I hope Derek from More Plates, More Dates can make an update to this experiment that he did to try to tell people that he never took into account scalp DHT, and the general framing of the video, I think it has caused a lot of harm because it makes people, especially those who aren't even taking exogenous testosterone or using any sort of anabolic steroids, right? It makes those normal everyday people freak out. No, Derek, that was kind of, flawed, but again, I hope you can make an update if you ever see this video, which you probably won't. So anyway, let's go into that next segment. This first part is going to involve a little bit of, mathematical reasoning. DHT is about 2 to 5 times more potent than testosterone. Some studies even show that it could be 10 times more potent. So decreasing DHT for testosterone doesn't increase the androgenetic effects that occur on the scalp. It would actually be the opposite due to DHT's potency. If we consider the binding affinity of testosterone to the androgen receptor as binding testosterone, And if you can look at the screen, we're going to be using some mathematical variables. So we have this mathematical variable, binding testosterone. And if we consider the binding affinity of dihydrotestosterone to the androgen receptor as binding DHT, it's established that binding DHT is twice that of binding testosterone. Furthermore, if we present the dissociation rate of testosterone as dissociation testosterone and that of dihydrotestosterone as dissociation DHT, we can state that the dissociation DHT is 1/5 of dissociation testosterone, given that DHT dissociates 5 times slower than testosterone. Now, again, this sounds like word salad, so please look at the screen, because if you can't, I just want to let you know I'm showing some of my math reasoning here. And if there are any more math endowed people in the audience, you're welcome to inform me better on this part if you want to. But anyway, let's keep going. The androgenic effect of a hormone is directly related to its binding affinity and inversely related to its dissociation rate. Thus, the androgenic effect of testosterone is proportional to binding testosterone divided by dissociation testosterone, and the androgenic effect of dihydrotestosterone is proportional to binding DHT divided by dissociation DHT. Using these relationships, we can deduce that the androgenic effect of dihydrotestosterone is 10 times that of testosterone. This indicates that for each unit of testosterone that gets converted to dihydrotestosterone, its androgenic effect is magnified about 10-fold. If we inhibit this conversion process, we retain the androgenic effect of testosterone but miss out on the 10-fold increase from dihydrotestosterone. By halting the conversion, we retain the androgenic effect of testosterone but lose 10 times that effect from dihydrotestosterone, resulting in a net loss of 9 times the androgenic effect of testosterone. This implies a reduction of the overall androgenic effect. Hence, inhibiting the conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone always leads to a decline in overall androgenicity, regardless of how much of the conversion is inhibited. So we have some sentential logic, right? Premise 1, binding affinity and dissociation rate. Given DHT has double the binding affinity to the androgen receptor compared to testosterone. DHT has a dissociation rate 5 times slower than testosterone. Premise 2, the androgenic effect of a hormone is determined by its binding affinity and its dissociation rate. So using the relationships from premise 1, this implies that DHT has a 10 times more androgenic effect of testosterone in tissues where it's active. And finally, for premise 3, inhibiting the conversion of testosterone to DHT increases the amount of testosterone but decreases the amount of DHT. So for every unit of testosterone not converted to DHT, you're going to witness a decline in the androgenic activity in the scalp. Because again, DHT is just more effective and more potent. So just on this first point alone, even if there is an increase in scalp testosterone due to the inhibition of its conversion to DHT, the overall androgenic effect in the scalp decreases. This is because the androgenic effect of the DHT that would have been produced is 10 times more potent, or, it just is about X times more potent, if we're using the higher bound, 10 times more potent than the increase in the androgenic effect from the additional T. Hence, inhibiting the conversion of testosterone to DHT will result in a decrease in the overall androgenicity in the scalp, irrespective of the increase of scalp testosterone. Now, the second point. Here, DHT and testosterone transcribe different genetic messages when they combine with the androgen receptor. I'm going to be reading from this particular study titled, quote, Modulation of Androgen Receptor Activation Function 2 by Testosterone and Dihydrotestosterone, unquote, by Askew et al. This study looks at how two male hormones, testosterone and DHT, affect the androgen receptor. This receptor plays a big role in things like muscle growth, bone health, and male reproductive development. It should also be noted that it plays a role in prostate health, as well as, you guessed it, male pattern baldness or androgenetic alopecia. While both testosterone and DHT can activate the androgen receptor, DHT does it more effectively. Imagine testosterone and DHT were keys, and the androgen receptor was a lock. Both keys can unlock the androgen receptor. However, DHT is a better fit, and it turns the lock more smoothly. The authors state how DHT is required for male sexual development, whereas testosterone is the major androgen in muscle growth and muscle composition in puberty. The doctors also reference Imperato McGinley, which we will look at later, about how even with normal levels of testosterone without turning into DHT, a male fetus will not completely develop male genitalia. Now, I have one more part after this, a third reasoning why testosterone isn't the enemy when it comes to scalp DHT, but just to touch on this before we get on to that third part, in that next point, I'll talk about the pseudohermaphrodites that were essentially men who were born with low levels of DHT due to having low 5-alpha reductase type 2 enzymes. This was a genetic defect that they had. Looking at Imperato McGinley et al. 1974 research on pseudohermaphrodites, these men often presented as infant girls upon their birth, having ambiguous or nearly feminine-looking genitalia. However, during puberty, these men would develop full and normally sized penises, suggesting that testosterone can also be inversely used in maintaining and developing sexual characteristics. So in this regard, we have some sort of a close fit, but not a nearly perfect role of DHT, that being testosterone that steps in. But that isn't the same for androgenetic alopecia. So I think I'm digressing, but back to the Askew et al. Paper. The researchers found that around a 10-fold higher concentration of testosterone is required to achieve the androgen receptor-mediated transcriptional effects of DHT. So this means for every 1 molecule of DHT, you need about 10 times the same amount of testosterone to achieve the same genetic effects that would induce something like androgenetic alopecia. But that isn't possible with just testosterone alone, because it's not like you can jam 10 testosterones into a single receptor. So essentially, it's saying like the only way you can get that sort of potency is if testosterone becomes DHT. So testosterone would have to become something entirely different. It can't be itself in order to achieve these greater transcriptional effects when it comes to DNA. You should understand that when testosterone comes in contact with the androgen receptor, or when DHT does so as well, it forms a testosterone androgen receptor complex, or a DHT androgen receptor complex. These complexes move into the cell nucleus where it interacts with DNA. You can imagine that this complex, due to its structure of DHT or testosterone, acts like a ring as it slides along your DNA. Here, certain genes are interacted with, and some are not. Some are turned on, and some are not at all. It depends on your genes, of course. So allow me to reiterate a bit more clearly. Both testosterone and DHT can activate the androgen receptor, but DHT does it more effectively. Again, imagine if testosterone and DHT were keys, and that the androgen receptor was a lock. Both keys can unlock it, but it is DHT that is a better fit, and it can turn the lock more smoothly. Back to the genetic basis, it is DHT that can transcribe more messages or different messages than testosterone can. That's why it's so potent. So in this case, like we will observe in the Imperato McGinley reasoning in the next point, it appears as if DHT is activating the genes that are involved with androgenetic alopecia, and testosterone cannot. The researchers for this particular Askew et al. Study further substantiate their claims by looking at the structure of these complexes. The primary difference in chemical structure between DHT and testosterone is that testosterone has a double bond between the 4th and 5th carbon atoms in its A ring, while DHT does not have this double bond, making its A ring saturated. It's worth looking at how the researchers were able to determine this, so I'm going to provide a gleam into their methodology. The researchers conducted a series of experiments referred to as biochemical data to understand how two hormones, testosterone and DHT, interact with the androgen receptor. Their findings revealed that testosterone does not activate the androgen receptor as potently as DHT. One of the primary reasons for this difference is testosterone's weaker interaction with specific sections of the androgen receptor, known as the FXXLF and the LXXLL motifs, particularly in a spot labeled as AF2. So again, like I mentioned before, testosterone and DHT are fitting differently when it comes to the androgen receptor, and their respective receptor complexes, the DHT androgen receptor complex versus the testosterone androgen receptor complex, potentially interact with DNA differently. Now moving on to our third point when it comes to testosterone not being the enemy of your hair follicles. It's actually DHT. So in this third point, we're going to be looking at men who are genetically deficient in the type 2 5-alpha reductase enzyme that never went bald despite having normal to high normal levels of testosterone, as seen in the research of Imparato McGinley et al. 1974 in the paper titled, quote, Steroid 5-alpha reductase deficiency in men, an inherited form of male pseudohermaphroditism, unquote. Imparato McGinley et al. 1974 make note of these men and how, quote, they develop a typical male phenotype with a substantial increase in muscle mass, unquote, along with also, quote, no temporal recession, unquote. So they didn't have any recession at their hairline. They had full heads of hair, essentially. The extended quote also mentions how many of these men, when they were born, presented as female infants with ambiguous genitalia, but upon puberty, these men developed full and normal-sized penises. So this harkens back to the second point I made previously when talking about the Askew et al. Modulation of androgen receptors and how testosterone and DHT interact with the androgen receptor. So let us reiterate on this particular Imparato McGinley study. And by the way, it took place in the Dominican Republic. So these Dominican pseudohermaphrodites were born with a type 2 5-alpha reductase deficiency, which caused them to have significantly lower DHT levels. They still had some DHT levels because they still had the type 1 5-alpha reductase enzyme. However, them not having much type 2 5-alpha reductase made their baseline DHT substantially lower, and thus they never went bald. And this is the reasoning, right? This is the reasoning why we use finasteride, because it is a type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. And we also use Dutasteride as well because it is a stronger type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. It seems as if when you reduce type 2 5-alpha reductase, you're going to reduce the presence of DHT in the scalp. So just these 3 points alone, from the first point with the mathematical reasoning when it came to the androgenicity of decreasing the scalp's androgenicity by preventing testosterone turning into DHT. Also the second point where we talk about how testosterone and DHT actually transcribe different genetic messages. And finally, to the third point, looking at Imparato McGinley's study on the pseudohermaphrodites who were born with a 5-alpha reductase type 2 deficiency, which caused them to be deficient in DHT. And in these men, when they went through puberty and past puberty, they didn't bald on their scalps. They had no signs of temporal recession. They had full heads of hair. Again, these 3 points alone are enough to show us that testosterone isn't the enemy when it comes to male pattern baldness. So anyone that keeps talking about this, they need to stop. Testosterone isn't causing, or I'll be charitable, it isn't significantly progressing your androgenetic alopecia. It's DHT. And if you're on a nuclear stack, maybe you just are super sensitive to DHT, and perhaps a topical anti-androgen is your only go-to bet. So yeah, that's the end of this part. So I guess that's it for this video.